So why did we bother learning all about arrays and objects? There's probably something I want to do with them in my code. So I still feel like I'm repeating myself here a little bit. When I submit my form, I've got this new piece of data. I've got information about this flick. All I know right now is the title and which Chris is in it, but I could eventually have more things. I could put the year, I could put my rating, I could put the MPAA rating, PG-13 for creature action violence, and some thematic material or whatever. So how about I build a little flick object to store all the good data? So I could say const flick equals a new object, has a name. The name is f.flickName.value. It has a Chris. The Chris is f.chrisName.value. So I can collect all these values. I'm going to put my trailing comma there because I like to do that so I don't forget about it later. And then what I'd like to do is instead of manually creating these two separate spans and calling render property twice, I'd like to say, for every property that happens to be inside flick, I want to call render property. See what I'm getting at? And so now we're getting to why I didn't call it add flick. I called it handle submit. Because add flick should be the function that does what I just described. It just takes everything that's in that flick and it builds the appropriate spans as necessary and just returns me the whole dang list. See what I'm getting at? Let's see if we can sort of head down that road. I'm not going to delete this stuff out of here just yet. So what I want is a function that just takes a flick as its argument, the only argument, and it returns me that entire thing, that entire collection of spans and so on. So I suppose, what else does it need to know? Let's see here. Is that enough? Yeah, I just wanted to... Okay, so this is render property. Maybe I just want to render the entire list item. Maybe that's what it should be called. Is that what it should be called? Yeah, let's call it that. Let's call it render item. So its job is going to be to build this entire list item. So I'm gonna end up putting this kind of stuff in there. So it's going to start with creating a list item, adding the class name, add each property. I don't know how to do that yet. And then when I'm done, make sure I return the list item. Add each property of the flick. Do you get it? See what I'm trying to do here? Wouldn't even have to be a flick. So I just want to get all of the items out of that flick and call render property for each one. How can I do that? How can I loop over each property of that object? For each is how I loop over a thing. But to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. To loop over an array, you have to have an array. And we don't have an array yet, do we? So remember, break these down into the small steps you possibly can. So we want to loop over each item in the object, but first we probably need to get a list of all the items in the object. So how do we do that? How do we get a list of all its properties? What did we just do? We just did that. Remember how we did that? Yep, that's it. Like you mean it. Tell them in the back. That's it. Thank you, Evelyn. Object.keys. And the object is flick. Yep, that totally gets us an array of all the properties. So once we have that, we just want to do something to each of them, right? So we want to do the same thing for each of those, so maybe we could call for each on that. How's that sound? for each. So what do we want to do for each one? Yeah, we want to render property for each one. Render property expects a name and a value. This will give us just the names, right? So we need something in between there. So let's see. We'll just write an anonymous function in here. And we know that the function is going to be passed what? What is each key? So this is going to give us back the array, something like, it's going to give us an array like name and Chris, right? That's what it's going to tell us. So what are those? Those are the names of each property, right? So we could say property name, just to be clear what's being passed into our callback here. Okay, so if we have that, and maybe this is easier if we const properties equals object.keysFlick. Properties.forEach. So then what do we want to do? We want to call render property, right? So what do I call exactly? What do I pass into render property? It expects a name and a value. So what's the name? Property name. And what's the value? Close. So flick.property name would actually expect the object to have a key called property name, right? But instead, property name is a variable holding the actual name of the property, right? Either name or Chris. You have to use square brackets, exactly. Understand why? So if you say dot, it's going to basically treat that as though you had quotes around it, right? That's not the variable property name. That's the string property name. That's just how it works when you use the dot to access a property of an object. It treats it as a string. If you use square bracket, then you can pass in a string if you wanted to with quotes around it. But if you don't have quotes, it'll treat that as, well, a JavaScript expression. So it could be a variable name like property name. Heck, it could be a function call. It can be whatever. So inside the square brackets, you can put any JavaScript expression. But if you use the dot syntax, then the thing after that it's expecting it to be a string without the quotes. So that lets us have very pretty looking syntax, so we can say things like flick.chris and get back Pratt or whatever, right? But since we don't know the name of the name of the property is in a variable, we have to use square brackets. It's just like, I already closed this thing. I sure did. Okay, so now we're going through and we're doing this for each one. So what's this going to get us? Render property is going to return. It's going to return a span element. So we need to be able to actually do something with those span elements. So we need to add each one of these. So do we want to like put in here? Where's our item? Here's our item. This is our list item. So maybe const span equals all that, and then item dot append child span. Is that what you want to do? Does that seem reasonable? Does this work? Let's just try running that. Let's make any object in the world. Doesn't have to be Flicks and Chris's, right? So let's say meals equals breakfast. Looks like we have last class's stuff. Ashley, what'd you have for breakfast? Pop-Tart. What's for lunch today, Matt?
Subway.
Subway. Eat fresh. What's for dinner tonight, Hinnock? You know what you're having yet?
Sandwich. I mean, chicken sandwich. I mean, everybody says sandwich. So
What was it, chicken? How's that? Okay. Okay, so we have meals. So all render item expects is an object, right? So I should be able to call render item, pass it in meals, and I get back a list item with a span, class breakfast, value, or text content, Pop-Tarts. Span with the class of lunch, Subway, Eat Fresh. Span with the class of dinner, text content, chicken. Totally works, right? Doesn't matter what kind of data it is. So we could totally pass a flick in there and get back the spans we want inside an LI. Why not? Get it? So now we have a function that works fine on its own. We'll worry about integrating it into the whole thing later. Guess what time it is? Later. Okay, let's do it. Get the list of properties. Loop over the properties. Append. Span. Build a span and append it to the list. Build a span and append it to the list. So now let's do all that. Pretty much all I need to do now. So I'm going to get back the list item. So it should just be able to say const item equals render item, pass in the flick, grab the list, append it. Look how much shorter handle submit is now. It's not handle submit's job to build the list item. We have a separate function for that. And it doesn't even need to know what's involved in that. It doesn't even need to know that it's creating all these spans. All it needs to know is this thing's going to give me back my list item, and I can append it to the page. Does it work? Enter flick. Captain America, Winter Soldier, cause, which Chris Evans. Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom. Let's fill it out. That's Chris. That's old Pratt. Totally works. Works the same way, but now we split it into more functions, so we have separate functions that do things kind of on their own. So we're one function per job that we're doing, right? It's not all one thing that we're doing here. We're doing several things. We're dealing with a form. We're building list items. We're building spans that go inside the list items, separating each of those jobs into their own function. You dig? So this may seem more complicated now, but it's actually kind of easier to test all these things in isolation. And once we get this thing doing even more complicated things, we're going to be glad that these are in separate functions, I think. So what do we do? Basically, we extracted render item function. Extract a function to build the list item for each flick. Cool.